Hello there, and welcome to the future site of the Maritime Museum of Morro Bay. The ground that I'm standing on will soon be transformed into a cultural center for the community and the Central Coast. And we're going to talk about that in the next few minutes, take a look at some of our collection, and talk about how you can help. Standing on a concrete slab, and this is actually the foundation of our first building. And it should be in construction by late summer or early fall. But the entire Maritime Museum complex actually consists of several components. It's the building, of course, where I'm standing, but landscaped areas with native plants and sort of a demonstration garden for local community members who want to get ideas about how to and what to plant in their own yards. And to my left, an area dedicated to California's first inhabitants, Native Americans, Chumash and Selenians, that were here 8,000 to 10,000 years ago in their relationship to the ocean. In April of 1963, just when the United States Navy was building up its nuclear submarine capability, there was a tremendous and well-known submarine disaster. Off the coast of New England, the USS Thresher was lost and all crew members aboard. It had been going through a series of tests, trying to root out some technical problems. But after that incident, there was an outcry about what would the Navy do to rescue crew members, rescue our boys off the bottom. And there were several people who bid on the idea, who had different ideas, but it was Lockheed Space and Missile Division up in Sunnyvale, California that came up with the idea of the DSRV. This is unique because it's a completely flyaway system. It was a portable, and it all went onto a back of trailers into a large C-5 Galaxy airplane, and it could be flown anywhere in the world near the disaster site, in less than a day, 12 to 24 hours. It would go out to the disaster site, seek and find the distressed submarine, and pull its crew members out and deliver them safely to a mother sub or a surface ship of opportunity. But this is on loan from the United States Navy History and Heritage Command. It's not owned by the Central Coast Maritime Museum Association. We are entrusted by the U.S. Navy to, as a custodian, to show it to the public and maintain it, and we are happy to do so. And it really fits with part of our mission, which is not only maritime history, but also science and technology. And just about nothing epitomizes maritime science and technology like a submarine. What you're seeing here is the culmination of Cold War technology that came out of the 50s and the 60s, and a lot of it from the space program. And in fact, the company that built this submarine actually was an aerospace company, Lockheed Space and Missile Division up in Sunnyvale, California. They started working on this in August of 1966. They started with the Mystic, and then that was launched in 1970, and this one behind me launched in July of 1971. We're going to go inside here in just a minute and take a look around. The vessel consists of 3 intersecting spheres covered in a fiberglass tube to give it hydrodynamic efficiency. This allowed for minimal drag while being propelled through the water with electric motors. The main shaft motor that drove it forward had 15 horsepower, and then there are 7.5 horsepower electric thruster motors fore and aft. This submarine does have a periscope of sort. It's a pivoting model that moves left or right on an articulating yoke. It gives a view down and forward. The cockpit had 2 pilot positions, and you can see there were a lot of switches and buttons, several computers. As the one that was in the lunar module for the Apollo landing in 1969, because it was a similar type of technical problem, landing in the dark abyss at a very precise point without looking outside. So it took a lot of skill and practice to be able to do that, and a lot of technology. 50 feet long, about 8.5 feet wide, and an operational weight of about 78,000 pounds. If the distressed submarine was not sitting perfectly level, that meant that this submarine, this vehicle, had to match that angle and pitch. And that wasn't easy to do. So They would get as close as they could by hand driving it with these levers and the thrusters and the up and down ability of the submarine itself. But then they would also do very minute corrections up to about 45 degrees using the mercury ballast they could pump from tank to tank. And again, because it's so heavy, it didn't take very much to be able to turn this vehicle left or right or up and down to match the same configuration as the distress submarine on the sea floor. I mentioned the mating skirt. That was a critical part of the DSRV because the pilot had to land this machine perfectly on the aft hatch of the distress sub. U.S. submarines and all submarines of different navies of the world that were part of this program had to ensure that the aft hatches of their fleet met the specifications to allow this mating skirt to mount in the event of a rescue. And in fact, the Navy employed a gentleman that went around inspecting submarines of the world that were part of the DSRV program to ensure that they met the spec. And if they did not, they were notified, and they could not rely on the DSRV coming to their aid in the event that they were called until they made those changes. Just imagine yourself at the bottom of the ocean floor, maybe 2,000 feet, and you're in a lot of distress and you're stranded. And you hear that this thing is just mounted on top of you and the hatch above you. And you get the all clear to go on and exit your submarine and get into this thing and home free. It was crowded inside, and rescuees sat next to each other. They would have to put their arms on top of each other's shoulders. When the vessel did one run, one evacuation, it would go back to its mothership and repeat the cycle all over again. But in the meantime, oxygen bottles were exchanged, its batteries were exchanged, and this cycle would occur over and over again. Typically, DSRVs were carried on the backs of fast attack submarines like the Los Angeles class boats. However, they could also be transported by a special surface ship that was created for the system. There were no actual rescues conducted by the Navy. And again, after 1968, with the USS Scorpion disaster, the Navy did not experience any serious submarine disasters that warranted full rescue. Consequently, both DSRVs engaged just in mock rescue drills and training exercises. But they were also engaged in research, and they were available for rent from the U.S. Navy by an institution or an entity such as a university or film company. The system was expensive to build, to operate, and maintain. Only two of these machines were built, the Mystic, named after an East Coast seaport in Connecticut, and the Avalon, of course, named after a West Coast seaport, Avalon at Catalina Island. The submarine rescue unit is still located at the Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego today. It's still there today with a different technology, but there's always a crew like a fire station ready to roll in a number of hours to a submarine disaster anywhere in the world. This is the Maritime Museum's surf rescue boat, donated by the U.S. Coast Guard and the Bureau of Land Management. The 615 you see here is 30 feet long, and it was built in Southern California by the Willard Boat Company for a price of about $113,000. And it was delivered here in Morro Bay, stationed here in 1996, and it served here for 2 or 3 years before it was retired. And it's been replaced by more modern, larger craft, but they all operate in the same principle. They're self-righting. They put the ballast down very low, and they put the flotation in the hull up high. So when it capsizes, it tends to want to right itself, upright. And this was a self-righting vessel, and it was intended for near shore, medium weather to rough weather conditions, and it had about a 100-mile range and could do about 30 knots. It will stay here, it will never go back in the water. It's part of the permanent static display of the Maritime Museum of Morro Bay. And when we have our open houses, we let people aboard this and take a look inside at the rescue compartment and the engine compartment, as well as the submarine that you saw a little bit earlier. The year was 1927. Calvin Coolidge was 30th President of the United States. And just after Charles Lindbergh flew the Atlantic, this little vessel to my left slid down the waves at a small family-owned boatyard in San Francisco into San Francisco Bay. This is the vessel Alma, 48 feet long and about 44,000 pounds. She's an important part of local maritime history. And her real claim to fame came a couple of weeks after Pearl Harbor, when a Japanese submarine, the I-21, torpedoed and sank a Union oil tanker just north of here. And the Alma and another local tugboat, the Rainier, were dispatched to go rescue the crew of the Montebello oil tanker. And she brought them safely back to the Cayucas Pier. And then during the war, she was employed by the Army and the Navy to tow targets. And then after the war, she worked in the petroleum industry, bumping up into tankers 10 times her size or more. She was finally retired by the company that operated her, Sylvester's Tugs of Morro Bay, and she was donated to the Central Coast Maritime Museum Association. Central Coast Maritime Museum Association, with volunteers and generous cash donations, not the least of which was the Hine Foundation, was able to restore her to a visible condition. And I say restore very loosely. She is not seaworthy. She will never be put in the water again, but she was restored sufficiently to be spruced up and made presentable, to be put on static display. She's constructed of wood, oak frames and fir planks, but in the early 1970s, her hull was covered in ferro cement for longevity. So occasionally volunteers get out here on the weekends and we touch up paint and we clean her off, and we're still working on the inside. So she is, in a sense, a work in progress, but she'll never go in the water again. She doesn't have to be seaworthy. She only has to sit here on her cradle. This is her permanent home where she can tell the story of her life as a working wooden boat on the coast of California. Thanks for spending some quality time with us today, learning about the Maritime Museum of Morro Bay. I hope you enjoyed our short little tour inside, looking at the submarine and looking at the project as a whole. You know, we're always looking for supporters and volunteers. So if you want to learn more about this and you have something to offer, give us a holler. Artifacts, photographs, ship models, and that sort of thing are greatly appreciated. And of course, funding is a big priority. So monetary donations are greatly appreciated. So once again, thanks for spending some time with us today, and hope to see you down here when we have one of our open houses, and please stay in touch. The Central Coast Maritime Museum Association, or CCMMA, is a non-profit group of volunteers working with the City of Morro Bay to create this Maritime Interpretive Center, the Maritime Museum of Morro Bay. It will be a cornerstone of civic pride and a contributor to the increasing understanding of respect for the maritime heritage of California, and especially Central California, Morro Bay and Estero Bay. Along with the construction of the center and preserving vessels of historic value, like the tugboat Alma and the DSRB Avalon, CCMMA sponsors visiting toll ships, such as the replica of Juan Cabrillo's San Salvador. Last year, in 2016, in a span of about 10 or 12 days, nearly 10,000 people on the Central Coast and the Central Valley were able to tour the ship to get a sense of what it was like for early Spanish explorers. Please join us.